In the gentle twilight of the early Middle Ages, we find ourselves at a moment in history where Europe seems both fragmented and full of potential. The Roman Empire has long since fallen, leaving behind scattered kingdoms, warlike tribes, and shifting alliances. Yet out of this patchwork world emerges one man whose presence radiates across centuries, Charlemagne, known also as Charles the Great. His story is not simply the tale of battles won or borders drawn, but rather of an ambitious vision that brought together lands, faiths, and cultures into the fragile beginnings of what we later call Europe. Tonight, as you rest, we will wander through his world, retracing his life and legacy in soft, measured steps, perfect for reflection and sleep. Charlemagne is born in the year 742, in a time when the memory of Rome still lingers like faded ruins among the hills of Europe. His father, Pepin the Short, has seized the crown of the Franks with the blessing of the Pope, and so Charles grows up in a court already woven with both royal and spiritual ambition. The young prince's world is filled with the rhythms of early medieval life. The tolling of monastery bells, the clatter of horses' hooves, the hush of candlelight flickering in wooden halls. While the chronicles of the time offer only glimpses of his childhood, they suggest a boy raised with the values of piety, duty, and martial readiness. As we ease into his story, it is worth pausing to consider what it means to live in 8th century Europe. The land is not unified. Instead, it is broken into countless small territories. Local lords guard their strongholds, farmers till the soil in scattered villages. Pilgrims and merchants thread their way along narrow paths between forests and rivers. Amid this uncertainty, the Frankish kingdom stands as one of the few powers with both ambition and structure. Its kings, descended from the Carolingian line, draw their strength not only from warriors, but also from their close partnership with the church. Religion and politics are inseparable here, forming the double pillars upon which Charlemagne's life will be built. The very name Charlemagne carries echoes of grandeur. In Latin, he is Carolus Magnus, Charles the Great. But greatness is not born overnight. It is forged in campaigns, in alliances, in learning, and in vision. When his father dies in 768, Charles inherits the Frankish crown together with his brother Carloman. The two brothers rule uneasily, sharing the realm in a partnership that is less than harmonious. The sudden death of Carloman in 771 leaves Charles as sole ruler, and with that event, the stage is set for his rise as one of the most powerful monarchs of the Middle Ages. Yet, Charlemagne is not only a conqueror. He is also a builder of institutions, a patron of education, and a figure whose fascination with law and order shapes the administration of his empire. He surrounds himself with scholars, encourages the copying of ancient texts, and reforms the system of governance. The so-called Carolingian Renaissance that flourishes under his reign is a gentle revival of art, learning, and culture, a light shining against the dim backdrop of post-Roman Europe. At the same time, the story of Charlemagne is inseparable from that of the Christian Church. His campaigns are not only political, but also spiritual. He wages war against pagan Saxons, he strengthens ties with the papacy, and in the year 800, he accepts from Pope Leo III the crown of emperor, reviving the ancient Roman title in a new medieval form. This coronation is more than a ceremony. It is a moment when faith and kingship intertwine, setting a precedent for centuries of European politics. The Holy Roman Empire, though not truly Roman and never entirely holy, begins with Carlemagne's acceptance of that crown on Christmas Day in Rome. As you listen, allow yourself to imagine the landscapes that frame his life. Picture the forests of Germania, dark and thick with pine. Imagine the sweeping fields of Gaul, dotted with villages of timber and thatch. See the mighty rivers, the Rhine, the Danube, the Seine, that serve as highways for armies and merchants alike. And finally, picture the palaces that Charlemagne builds. Stone halls at Aachen, with their soaring chapels and marble columns brought from distant Italy. These images, when stitched together, form not only the biography of a man, but the birth of a continent's shared identity. Charlemagne's life is a balance of contrasts. He is a warrior who sheds blood, yet dreams of order and stability. He is a deeply religious man who sometimes bends faith to the needs of power. He is a king who cannot write, yet he champions education. These tensions give his story richness, making him not simply a figure of the past, but a mirror for questions that echo through time. How do leaders unite divided peoples? How do cultures preserve knowledge amid uncertainty? And how does ambition shape destiny? As our journey unfolds, we will move slowly through his world, chapter by chapter. We will linger on his youth, follow him into battle, watch as he forges alliances, and step into the quiet halls of learning he fosters. We will meet the figures who stand beside him, popes, queens, scholars, and generals, and observe the web of loyalty and betrayal that surrounds a throne. Charlemagne's death in 814 marks not an end, but a transformation. His empire soon fragments under the strains of succession, yet his vision persists. The idea of a united Christendom, the notion of empire as a guardian of both faith and law, continues to influence rulers for centuries. In that sense, Charlemagne does not truly vanish. His memory, preserved in chronicles, in architecture, in law, and in legend, becomes a guiding thread woven into the very fabric of European identity. As you prepare to drift into rest, hold in mind that Charlemagne's story is not merely about power. It is about the possibility of unity, about the fragile balance of faith and ambition, and about the endurance of ideas across generations. Tonight, let us walk softly into his world, retracing the path from a Frankish prince to the emperor who gave Europe both a crown and a dream. The story of Charlemagne begins not in isolation, but within the wider current of his family's lineage and the shifting world of the early medieval period. To understand how he could rise as emperor, we must first step back and look at the Frankish kingdom into which he was born, the roots of the Carolingian dynasty, and the condition of Europe in the 8th century. This opening landscape provides the foundation for all that follows, and it allows us to see Charlemagne not as a sudden, miraculous figure, but as a man shaped by a particular time and place. The Franks were a Germanic people, one of many who had emerged during the collapse of the Roman Empire in the 5th century. Settling in what had been the Roman province of Gaul, they formed small kingdoms under the Merovingian dynasty. These Merovingian kings, remembered for their flowing hair which symbolized royal authority, ruled through a mixture of tribal tradition and lingering Roman custom. Over time, however, their power weakened, and it was increasingly the mayors of the palace, the chief officials of the royal household, who held real authority. Among these mayors rose the family that would become the Carolingians, named after Charles Martel, the grandfather of Charlemagne. Charles Martel is remembered as the defender of Christendom, celebrated for halting the advance of Muslim forces at the Battle of Tours in 732. Though the true scope of that battle's significance is debated by historians, the image of Martel as savior of Christian Europe deeply influenced his descendants. His son, Pepin the Short, went even further. With the blessing of the Pope, Pepin deposed the last Merovingian king, and in 751 was anointed as the first Carolingian king of the Franks. This moment entwined the Carolingian dynasty with the authority of the Church in a way that would shape all of Charlemagne's reign. When Charlemagne was born in 742, Europe was a patchwork of peoples and powers. To the north lay the Saxons, still holding to their old pagan beliefs. To the east stretched the Avars and Slavs, formidable in battle. To the south, in Italy, the Lombards ruled, while the Pope in Rome looked anxiously for protection. And across the Pyrenees, the lands of Al-Andalus flourished under Muslim rule. It was a world where faith, sword, and politics were constantly interwoven. For a Frankish prince, it was both a dangerous and an opportune landscape. Of Charlemagne's early life, the records are sparse. Medieval chroniclers were often more interested in great deeds than childhood details. Yet we can imagine the environment in which he grew. The fortified royal villas with their timber halls and stone chapels, the monasteries where Latin chants echoed and books were copied by patient hands, the bustling markets where traders brought goods from distant places. As a boy, he likely learned to ride, to hunt, to wield weapons, and to listen attentively to the liturgy that structured daily life. Unlike some of his subjects, he would have grown up aware of both his Frankish heritage and the Roman legacy that still lingered in law and architecture. When Pepin the Short died in 768, the kingdom was divided between his two sons, Charlemagne and Carloman. Such divisions were customary, as Frankish inheritance law often split territories among male heirs. But this arrangement was fraught with tension. Charlemagne ruled the western and northern regions, while Carloman controlled the central lands. The two brothers did not share an easy partnership, and Europe once again seemed poised for instability. The situation resolved itself abruptly in 771 when Carloman died unexpectedly. Charlemagne swiftly moved to claim his brother's lands, consolidating the Frankish kingdom under his sole authority. It was a decisive moment, one that gave him the platform to embark on the conquests and reforms that would define his reign. It is important to pause here and reflect on what the Frankish kingdom represented at this time. It was not yet the vast empire it would become, but it was larger and more organized than many neighboring realms. The Franks had adopted elements of Roman law, maintained strong warrior traditions, and cultivated close ties with the church. Villages of farmers provided the foundation of the economy, while monasteries served as centers of learning and record-keeping. Above all, the Carolingian kings presented themselves as protectors of Christianity, defenders of the faith, in a world filled with both internal divisions and external threats. Charlemagne's very name, Charles the Great, would come to symbolize the unity of these strands. He was heir to his grandfather's martial fame, to his father's alliance with the papacy, and to the traditions of both Germanic leadership and Roman governance. From the beginning, his reign was built upon these foundations. As we drift gently into the deeper chapters of his life, it is worth holding on to an image of this young king at the threshold of power. He is a man still in his 20s, standing at the helm of a kingdom recently expanded, surrounded by advisors both secular and spiritual. The weight of expectation rests heavily upon him, to defend his people, to extend their borders, and to uphold the sacred bond with the church. The years ahead will test his ambition, his faith, and his endurance. But already, the outlines of greatness can be traced in the soil of Francia, in the rhythms of daily life, and in the steady pulse of history carrying him forward. This is where the story of Charlemagne truly begins, with a youth shaped by inheritance, by faith, and by the restless energies of a fragmented continent. From these beginnings, the path stretches toward empire, toward renewal, and toward a legacy that endures across centuries. With the passing of his brother Carloman in 771, Charlemagne stepped into a moment of profound change. The Frankish kingdom, once divided in uneasy halves, became his alone to command. What might have been a source of fraternal rivalry suddenly transformed into an opportunity for unified rule. Yet such transitions were never simple. Rivals within and without still questioned his legitimacy, and the delicate bonds with the papacy needed careful tending. In this section, we drift deeper into the ways Charlemagne secured his authority, consolidated power, and began to chart the course that would lead him from Frankish king to emperor. The death of Carloman was sudden, and his territories might easily have slipped into chaos. His widow fled with their sons to the Lombard court in Italy, where King Desiderius offered them refuge. This move posed a direct challenge to Charlemagne, for the Lombards could claim to protect Carloman's heirs as rightful rulers. For a young monarch, the threat of internal division and foreign interference loomed heavily. Yet Charlemagne moved with remarkable decisiveness. He quickly took possession of his brother's lands and had himself recognized as sole ruler by Frankish nobles. In this way, he prevented fragmentation before it could begin. Charlemagne's skill in consolidating power was not only military, but also political. He cultivated the loyalty of the Frankish aristocracy, granting them lands and privileges in return for service. These lords, or counts as they were called, became the backbone of his administration. Their role was to oversee local justice, collect tribute, and provide soldiers when needed. By carefully binding them to his person, Charlemagne wove a network of obligations that extended his authority far beyond the reach of a single court. At the same time, his relationship with the papacy became a cornerstone of his legitimacy. His father, Pepin, had already secured papal sanction to become king, and Charlemagne deepened this bond. In the early years of his reign, he married Desiderata, the daughter of King Desiderius of the Lombards, in an attempt to secure peace with Italy. Yet the marriage soon dissolved, angering Desiderius and pushing Charlemagne closer to the Pope. This alliance with Rome would later prove decisive, for it was the Pope's crown that would transform a Frankish king into a Roman emperor. Even in these early days, Charlemagne revealed his skill at balancing force with diplomacy. He understood that his kingdom sat at the crossroads of Europe, where alliances and rivalries shifted like tides. To the north were Saxon tribes resisting Christian conversion. To the south were Lombards and the Pope, often in conflict. To the west lay the remnants of Visigothic power in Spain, and to the east the mysterious steppe peoples who could raid across frontiers without warning. A king who ruled such a realm required not only a sword, but also a clear sense of timing and purpose. Charlemagne's personal qualities also played a role in his rise. Contemporary descriptions emphasize his imposing stature, over 6 feet tall, broad-shouldered, with commanding presence. He was said to possess both energy and endurance, able to lead armies across vast distances and to preside over lengthy councils. Yet he was also noted for his simplicity in habits. He dressed plainly, ate modestly, and shared in the rhythms of his court. Such qualities distinguished him from rulers who relied on opulence. Instead, his authority rested on personal strength, faith, and a sense of duty. Consolidation of power also meant dealing with internal unrest. In the Frankish lands, as in many medieval societies, rival noble families sometimes resisted royal control. Charlemagne responded by reinforcing the role of royal assemblies, gatherings where nobles pledged loyalty and discussed policies. These assemblies became both ceremonial affirmations of unity and practical mechanisms for governance. By making participation in royal councils a privilege, Charlemagne ensured that loyalty was rewarded with a voice in shaping the kingdom. Another measure he took was the careful cultivation of image. Medieval rulers did not have printing presses or newspapers, but they did have chronicles and songs. Monks recorded events in annals, often portraying the king in ways that emphasized divine favor and justice. Poets and singers celebrated his victories, carrying his fame to distant villages. In this way, Charlemagne's reputation was not confined to the walls of his palace. It seeped outward, carried on words and memories. It is also during these early years that we glimpse Charlemagne's lifelong tension between family and politics. He arranged marriages for political gain, sometimes discarding alliances when they no longer suited his aims. His annulment of Desiderata's marriage was one such example. These decisions could provoke enmity, but also demonstrate his willingness to prioritize long-term stability over short-term convenience. The realm he ruled was too large and too fragile for sentiment to dictate policy. By the mid-770s, Charlemagne had successfully absorbed Carloman's territories, secured the loyalty of his nobles, and reaffirmed ties with the church. He stood as the undisputed ruler of the Frankish kingdom, with both the military and spiritual resources to expand his influence. Europe's fragmented landscape was, for the first time in centuries, beginning to bend toward the vision of a single monarch. Yet this was only the beginning. His consolidation of power was not an end in itself, but a foundation for the campaigns, reforms, and transformations that would follow. As we close this section, picture Charlemagne in the royal palace of Quercy, seated among his nobles in a hall lit by torches and warmed by the crackle of fire. Outside, the chill of the Frankish winter settles over fields and forests, but within, voices echo with loyalty and ambition. The young king has secured his throne, but he knows that the true measure of greatness lies not in holding power, but in using it to shape the destiny of his people. With his brother's death behind him and the weight of a united kingdom on his shoulders, Charlemagne now turns toward the horizon where conquest, faith, and empire await. Charlemagne's consolidation of power at home soon gave way to a restless drive for expansion. To him, ruling the Frankish kingdom was never enough. He envisioned a wider realm that would unite peoples, defend Christendom, and extend the authority of both crown and cross. In this section, we will journey through his wars of expansion, not in the loud and hurried rhythm of battle, but with the quiet observation of how these campaigns slowly reshaped the map of Europe. The Saxons were the most persistent of Charlemagne's foes, and his campaigns against them spanned more than 3 decades. The Saxons lived to the northeast of Francia, in lands thick with forests and crossed by winding rivers. They clung fiercely to their pagan traditions, resisting both conquest and conversion. For Charlemagne, subduing the Saxons was not merely a matter of extending borders, but of fulfilling a spiritual mission. He believed that the unity of his realm depended on bringing these neighboring peoples into the fold of Christianity. The Saxon wars were grueling. Each time Charlemagne advanced, the Saxons resisted, retreating into the woods and marshes, only to return when Frankish armies withdrew. Charlemagne responded with determination, building forts, forcing mass baptisms, and instituting harsh laws against pagan practices. At times, the violence was severe, reflecting the starkness of the age. Yet in these measures, we also glimpse the deep connection between faith and politics in Charlemagne's rule. For him, conquest and conversion were two sides of the same coin. While the Saxons occupied much of his attention, Charlemagne also turned his gaze southward to Italy. The Lombards, a Germanic people who had settled in the peninsula, posed both political and religious challenges. They controlled large parts of Italy and often threatened the Pope in Rome. When Pope Hadrian I appealed to Charlemagne for protection, he answered swiftly. In 773, he crossed the Alps with his army, braving snow and treacherous passes. The Lombard capital at Pavia fell after a long siege, and Charlemagne declared himself king of the Lombards, the first time a Frankish ruler had taken a crown outside his homeland. This victory in Italy did more than expand his territory. It reinforced his role as protector of the church. By defending the papacy and taking the Lombard crown, Charlemagne tied his dynasty more closely to Rome. The symbolic weight of this act cannot be overstated. He was no longer only king of the Franks, but also ruler of lands central to the legacy of the ancient empire. To the west, Charlemagne ventured into Spain, though with less enduring success. In 778, he launched a campaign against the Umayyad rulers of Al-Andalus. His forces advanced into the Iberian Peninsula, but met resistance and logistical difficulties. On their return, his rear guard was ambushed in the Pyrenees at Roncevaux Pass. This skirmish, though minor in scale, left a deep cultural mark. It inspired the Song of Roland, one of the earliest and most famous works of medieval literature. In this epic, Charlemagne's campaign is cast as a grand struggle between Christian knights and Muslim forces, though the historical reality was far more complex. To the east, Charlemagne faced the formidable Avars, a nomadic people who had settled in the Danube basin. Their ring-shaped fortresses and swift cavalry posed a unique challenge. In a series of campaigns during the 790s, Charlemagne's armies dismantled the power of the Avars, seizing their treasure and breaking their hold on Central Europe. This victory opened new lands for settlement and strengthened Frankish influence along the Danube. In each of these campaigns, we see not only the expansion of borders, but also the weaving together of a vast and diverse empire. The Franks, Lombards, Saxons, Bavarians, and others all came under the umbrella of Charlemagne's rule. Yet this unity was fragile, held together by oaths of loyalty, military presence, and the shared fabric of Christianity. Charlemagne understood this fragility and worked constantly to reinforce it, often using assemblies and councils to renew bonds with his nobles and with the church. It is important to recognize that war in the 8th and 9th centuries was not continuous clashing of armies, but a rhythm of campaigns and seasons. Armies gathered in spring, marched in summer, and dispersed in autumn to tend to their lands. Campaigns meant long journeys, the building of camps, and the maintenance of supply lines as much as direct fighting. Charlemagne himself often rode at the head of his forces, a visible symbol of unity. His presence mattered, for medieval kingship was deeply personal. The king was not only a ruler, but the living embodiment of authority and protection. These wars also reshaped daily life within the empire. New lands meant new resources, fresh opportunities for settlement, and new responsibilities for nobles. Conquered peoples were often required to swear loyalty, pay tribute, or accept baptism. Fortresses rose along frontiers, and monasteries spread into newly Christianized lands, serving as centers of both worship and administration. The empire stretched wider, yet it remained bound together by a network of faith, obligation, and shared destiny. As we drift from one battlefield to another, it is easy to imagine the landscapes Charlemagne's armies traversed. The misty woods of Saxony, where rivers wound like silver threads. The snow-bound passes of the Alps, where footsteps crunched on frozen paths. The sunlit plains of Lombardy, dotted with walled cities. The wide Danube Valley, echoing with the sounds of hoofbeats. Each campaign stitched another piece of land into the patchwork of the empire. creating a realm that stretched farther than any seen in Western Europe since the fall of Rome. By the end of these wars of expansion, Charlemagne stood as master of a realm that spanned much of continental Europe. Yet conquest alone could not sustain an empire. The lands he ruled were vast, diverse, and often resistant. To hold them together required more than armies. It required vision, administration, and symbols of unity. These challenges will guide us into the next chapters of his story, as we follow not only the warrior king, but the builder of an empire. The wars of expansion gave Charlemagne control over a vast and varied realm, but it was a single ceremony in the year 800 that transformed him from king into emperor, altering the course of European history. On Christmas Day, in the old Basilica of St. Peter's in Rome, Pope Leo III placed a crown upon his head and proclaimed him Imperator Romanorum, Emperor of the Romans. The coronation was both the culmination of decades of conquest and the beginning of a new political vision. In this section, we move gently through the meaning of that moment, the delicate relationship between crown and church, and the way the idea of empire returned to medieval Europe. The events leading to the coronation were shaped by turbulence in Rome. Pope Leo III had faced opposition from powerful Roman nobles who accused him of misconduct and even attempted to blind and depose him. Desperate, Leo fled north and sought refuge at Charlemagne's court. Charlemagne, ever aware of the value of papal partnership, escorted him back to Rome, restored him to his position, and convened a council to clear his name. This act bound king and pope closer than ever, for Leo owed his restored authority to Charlemagne's protection. The coronation itself was steeped in symbolism. As Charlemagne knelt in prayer during the Christmas Mass of the year 800, Leo suddenly placed a golden crown upon his head. The congregation acclaimed him as Emperor of the Romans. With this act, the ancient imperial dignity, long vanished in the West since the fall of Rome, was revived in a new form. Charlemagne, a Frankish king from the northern forests, was now presented as heir to the Caesars. For contemporaries, the meaning of this coronation was profound. It represented not merely a personal honor, but the revival of the idea of empire as a unifying principle. In a Europe fractured by kingdoms and tribes, the image of a single emperor ruling with divine favor gave new shape to political imagination. Yet the act also carried complexities. To the Byzantine emperors in Constantinople, who still called themselves Roman, the coronation was an affront, a challenge to their legitimacy. For the papacy, it was a demonstration that spiritual authority could bestow temporal crowns. For Charlemagne himself, it was both an honor and a delicate burden. Medieval chroniclers differ on whether Charlemagne expected the coronation or was surprised by it. Some accounts suggest he would not have entered St. Peter's had he known the Pope's intentions. Others imply he welcomed the title, but preferred to frame it as the will of God rather than the act of a pope. What is clear is that Charlemagne was careful to assert that his imperial dignity came from divine providence, not from papal gift. The balance between papal and imperial power would become one of the defining tensions of medieval Europe. The title of emperor elevated Charlemagne above other kings, but it also raised expectations. As emperor, he was no longer merely ruler of the Franks and Lombards, but guardian of all Christendom. His responsibilities extended beyond borders, into the realm of faith, justice, and culture. He was now expected to embody the dual roles of defender of the church and ruler of a universal empire. This duality explains why his reign became associated with both war and learning, with law and worship, with conquest and renewal. The coronation also deepened the rituals of kingship. Charlemagne's court began to emphasize imperial imagery, processions with banners, thrones elevated in great halls, seals stamped with titles that evoked Roman grandeur. The Palatine Chapel at Aachen, with its octagonal dome and glittering mosaics, became not only a place of worship, but a symbol of imperial majesty. Its marble columns, brought from Ravenna and Rome, linked Charlemagne's new empire to the material legacy of the ancient one. At the same time, Charlemagne remained practical and grounded. He did not build a capital like Rome, but rather ruled from a network of palaces across his realm, traveling constantly to oversee his lands. His empire was not a centralized bureaucracy, but a patchwork of regions bound by oaths, assemblies, and the king's personal presence. The imperial title gave unity in name, but the daily work of governance remained a balance of local loyalties, traditions, and enforcement. It is soothing to imagine the atmosphere of Rome on that Christmas day. Candles glowed against the ancient columns of the basilica, the air heavy with incense and the low hum of chants. Outside, pilgrims and guards mingled in the winter chill. Inside, a Frankish king knelt at the altar, unaware, or perhaps deeply aware, that his life was about to shift into legend. The crown placed upon his head was not only gold, but a symbol heavy with centuries of meaning. The coronation of 800 stands as a turning point, not only in Charlemagne's life, but in the entire course of medieval Europe. It revived the imperial title in the West, it entwined papacy and monarchy in new ways, and it provided a model of authority that rulers would imitate for generations. The Holy Roman Empire, though never fully Roman nor always holy, was born in that moment, and its echoes would sound across the Middle Ages. As we let this moment settle, think of the quiet after the ceremony. Charlemagne leaving St. Peter's, the crown upon his head, the city of Rome spread out in winter silence. The empire he now embodied was both ancient and new, fragile and grand, personal and universal. He carried not only the weight of conquest, but the burden of an idea, the dream of unity, of faith, of empire reborn. It is a dream that would guide Europe through centuries of struggle and renewal, long after his own footsteps had faded. With the imperial crown upon his head, Charlemagne was no longer only the king of a people, but the ruler of an empire. Yet empire is not sustained by coronations alone. It must live in the daily rhythms of governance, in the places where rulers dwell, and in the customs that surround their courts. To understand Charlemagne's reign fully, we must step into his palaces, observe the rituals of his household, and imagine the lives of those who served, prayed, and labored within his domains. This section offers a calm passage into the architecture, daily life, and courtly culture that gave shape to the Carolingian world. Charlemagne's most famous residence was at Aachen in modern-day Germany. Nestled amid gentle hills and natural hot springs, Aachen became his favored seat and the symbolic heart of his empire. The palace complex he built there was more than a royal dwelling. It was a statement of imperial ambition, modeled consciously on Roman and Byzantine examples. The centerpiece was the Palatine Chapel, a striking octagonal structure crowned by a dome. Within its walls, marble columns and mosaics shimmered in candlelight, many of them brought from Italy to evoke the grandeur of antiquity. When one enters this space in imagination, one can almost hear the echo of chants, the shuffle of attendants, and the solemn intonations of imperial liturgy. The palace at Aachen was not an isolated fortress, but a bustling hub. Surrounding the chapel were royal halls for assemblies, residences for nobles, quarters for servants, and schools for the education of young aristocrats. Here, Charlemagne received ambassadors, held councils, and presided over ceremonies. The court was at once a political center, a spiritual beacon, and a stage where imperial identity was performed. Yet Charlemagne did not remain always at Aachen. Like many rulers of his time, he moved through a network of palaces, Quercy, Nijmegen, Ingelheim, and others, ensuring that his presence was felt across his realm. Each of these palaces reflected the blend of practicality and grandeur characteristic of Carolingian architecture. Timber halls for gatherings, stone chapels for worship, and surrounding farms to sustain the household. To picture one of these palaces is to see a place at once austere and lively, where nobles discussed law by firelight, monks illuminated manuscripts in quiet alcoves, and children of the court played in open courtyards. The daily life of Charlemagne himself was marked by simplicity as well as ceremony. Contemporary accounts, particularly that of his biographer Einhard, describe a man of regular habits. He favored plain clothing, often of Frankish style, and avoided excessive luxuries. His meals were modest, consisting of roasted meats, bread, and seasonal fruits, accompanied by wine or ale. He enjoyed conversation during meals, preferring the company of scholars and clerics who engaged him in discussions of scripture and learning. Though emperor, he remained approachable. His authority expressed more through presence than ostentation. Mornings at court often began with prayer, followed by councils where nobles and advisors presented matters of law, taxation, and administration. Afternoons might be devoted to hearing petitions, reviewing military preparations, or overseeing construction projects. Evenings offered a quieter rhythm, readings from scripture or history, music performed by court musicians, or lessons recited by his children. Charlemagne valued education deeply, ensuring that his sons and daughters received instruction in languages, law, and piety. The palace, in this sense, functioned as both school and sanctuary. The people surrounding Charlemagne also give us insight into his court. Queens and concubines played roles not only in dynastic alliances, but in shaping the household's social fabric. Nobles brought retinues of warriors, binding their fortunes to the emperor's success. Clerics offered spiritual guidance and managed the writing of laws, charters, and annals. Scholars, many brought from distant lands such as England, Ireland, and Italy, enriched the court with knowledge. Each of these figures contributed to the texture of daily life, creating a court that was cosmopolitan as well as Frankish. Beyond the walls of palaces, the empire breathed with the rhythms of peasant life. Villages clustered near rivers and fields, where farmers tilled the soil with wooden plows, raised livestock, and paid tribute to their lords. Seasonal festivals marked the passage of time: harvest celebrations, winter feasts, and Christian holy days. The church calendar structured the year, with bells calling villagers to worship and monasteries anchoring the landscape as centers of learning and hospitality. For the vast majority of Charlemagne's subjects, empire was not experienced in grand ceremonies, but in the protection offered by fortified lords, the justice delivered in local assemblies, and the familiar sound of prayers intoned in Latin. Architecture and daily life together created a sense of stability that was essential for the empire's endurance. Charlemagne's palaces projected authority, while his habits of simplicity offered a model of kingly virtue. The life of the court, with its mixture of nobility, clergy, and scholars, represented a microcosm of the empire itself, diverse, bound together by loyalty, and oriented toward faith. The everyday labors of farmers, artisans, and monks sustained this structure, giving material reality to the vision of unity that the emperor embodied. As we pause in this section, imagine yourself drifting through the palace at Aachen. You walk past the steaming baths fed by natural springs, where courtiers relax and converse. You enter the chapel, where candles glimmer against marble brought from distant lands, and the air hums with the low murmur of prayers. You step into the hall where Charlemagne listens intently to his advisors. His tall frame wrapped in simple garments, his eyes steady, his presence both calm and commanding. Around him swirl the countless details of empire, yet within these walls there is a rhythm of order, dignity, and enduring faith. The palaces and daily life of Charlemagne's reign reveal the human side of empire, the texture of existence behind the grandeur of titles and conquests. They remind us that empire is not only battles and treaties, but the quiet routines of rulers and subjects, the spaces they inhabit, and the traditions they cultivate. In the stillness of the night, these images linger, carrying us gently forward to the story of how Charlemagne's court became the seedbed of a cultural flowering known as the Carolingian Renaissance. As Charlemagne's empire grew in size and stature, so too did his vision of what it could become. He was not content to preside merely as a warlord or political ruler. He longed to cultivate a world where faith, learning, and order could flourish together, sustaining the fragile unity he had built through conquest. From this vision emerged what historians call the Carolingian Renaissance, a period of cultural revival and reform that illuminated the early Middle Ages with a quiet but enduring light. In this section, we drift through that flowering of learning, art, and administration, seeing how Charlemagne's court became both a guardian of the past and a seedbed for the future. The word Renaissance means rebirth, and though the Carolingian version was modest compared with the later Italian Renaissance, it represented a vital turning point. The centuries after the fall of Rome were marked by decline in literacy, decay of institutions, and fragmentation of culture. By the late 8th century, many regions of Europe had little access to formal learning. Even the clergy, responsible for preserving scripture and teaching the faithful, often lacked proper training. Charlemagne recognized this as a danger to both religion and governance. An empire held together by Christianity required priests who could read Latin correctly, judges who could apply laws consistently, and administrators who could write charters and records with clarity. To address these needs, Charlemagne gathered scholars from across Europe, One of the most prominent was Alcuin of York, an English monk renowned for his learning. Alcuin became a central figure in Charlemagne's court, advising on theology, education, and cultural policy. Under his influence, the palace school at Aachen flourished, teaching not only the royal children, but also the sons of nobles and clerics. Subjects included grammar, rhetoric, logic, arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy, collectively known as the 7 liberal arts. These disciplines, inherited from the Roman tradition, provided a foundation for educated service to the empire. The reforms extended beyond the palace. Charlemagne issued capitularies, royal decrees, that required bishops and abbots to establish schools in their dioceses and monasteries. These schools were to provide instruction not only in scripture, but also in the practical skills of reading, writing, and calculation. In this way, learning spread across the empire, reaching into towns and rural areas where it had long been neglected. Though not every child attended, the effort marked a significant step toward rebuilding a literate society. One of the most enduring contributions of the Carolingian Renaissance was the development of a clear and uniform script known as Carolingian minuscule. Before this reform, manuscripts were often copied in cramped, irregular handwriting that made them difficult to read. Under Charlemagne's encouragement, scribes adopted a new style of rounded, legible letters, with spaces between words and consistent punctuation. This script not only made reading easier, but also allowed texts to be copied and transmitted more reliably. Many classical works of antiquity survive today because they were recopied in Carolingian script during this period. Art and architecture also reflected the spirit of renewal. Illuminated manuscripts, adorned with careful lettering and delicate decoration, carried the words of scripture and learning into the hearts of readers. Metalwork, ivory carvings, and textiles produced in workshops enriched the liturgy and adorned churches. The Palatine Chapel at Aachen, with its octagonal dome, mosaics, and imported columns, stood as a physical embodiment of this cultural flowering, blending Roman grandeur with Frankish vigor. It served not only as a place of worship, but also as a statement of continuity between past and present. Charlemagne's reforms in law and administration further reveal the renaissance of his reign. He sought to standardize laws across his diverse empire, ensuring that justice was applied fairly. Counts and officials were required to enforce royal decrees, and royal envoys known as missi dominici traveled the empire to inspect local governance. These envoys, often paired as a noble and a cleric, represented the dual pillars of secular and spiritual authority. Their task was to listen to grievances, review judgments, and ensure that the king's will was observed even in distant provinces. Behind these reforms was not merely a desire for efficiency, but a deeper conviction. Charlemagne believed himself responsible before God for the souls and welfare of his people. To rule justly was an act of piety. To encourage learning was to strengthen the church. To preserve knowledge was to honor the legacy of Christian and classical wisdom alike. In this way, the Carolingian Renaissance was not a purely intellectual endeavor, but an expression of faith woven into governance. It is soothing to picture the quiet labor of a Carolingian scriptorium. Monks sit in long wooden rooms, quills scratching on parchment, the smell of ink mingling with candle smoke. One copies the Psalms, another a letter of St. Augustine, another perhaps a fragment of Virgil. Outside, fields lie green under the sun, but within these cloisters, knowledge is preserved stroke by stroke. The emperor himself, though unable to write fluently, valued these works deeply. He is said to have kept tablets by his bed, tracing letters in attempts to learn. His own struggle to write reflected his commitment to education, showing that even kings are students before knowledge. The Carolingian Renaissance did not erase the hardships of medieval life. Famines, wars, and political tensions still marked the age. Yet within the steady pulse of monasteries, schools, and councils, a new rhythm took shape, a rhythm of learning, reform, and hope. The revival of literacy, the standardization of script, the building of schools, and the preservation of texts all ensured that the wisdom of the past was not lost, but carried forward into future centuries. As we close this section, imagine the empire not as a battlefield, but as a constellation of lights. The glow of candles in chapels, the soft murmur of students in schools, the patient work of scribes in monasteries. Together, these lights form a network of learning across the Frankish world. It is in these gentle details, as much as in battles and coronations, that Charlemagne's greatness resides. His vision of unity included not only land and law, but the life of the mind, ensuring that his empire was nourished by wisdom as well as power. Charlemagne's reign cannot be fully understood without considering his relationship with the church. For him, the bond between faith and power was not an optional alliance, but the very foundation of his authority. In his mind, to be emperor was to be the guardian of Christendom, entrusted by God with the care of both souls and lands. In this section, we step softly into the delicate interplay of faith and politics, exploring how Charlemagne shaped the spiritual life of his empire, and how, in turn, the church shaped him. From his earliest days, Charlemagne understood that the legitimacy of his family rested on papal sanction. His father, Pepin the Short, had been anointed king by papal authority, setting a precedent that kingship itself was sanctified by the church. Charlemagne extended this pattern. He consistently portrayed his wars against the Saxons, Lombards, and Avars not simply as political struggles, but as holy endeavors, missions to spread Christianity and defend the faithful. In this way, he cast himself as more than a ruler. He was a Christian king whose sword was an instrument of divine will. The Saxon Wars are a vivid example of this fusion of faith and power. Charlemagne demanded not only submission but baptism, insisting that conquered Saxons embrace Christianity. He issued harsh decrees against pagan practices, declaring that those who refused baptism could face death. These measures, while severe, reveal how deeply he believed that unity of faith was essential for unity of empire. For him, the spread of Christianity was inseparable from the extension of political control. At the same time, Charlemagne was a reformer of religious life within his own lands. He convened church councils to regulate doctrine, discipline, and liturgy. He urged bishops and abbots to enforce moral standards, to supervise clergy carefully, and to educate the faithful. He issued capitularies requiring priests to preach in the language of the people, so that sermons might be understood by all. In this, we see a concern not only for authority, but also for accessibility, an effort to bring the mysteries of faith closer to daily life. Monasteries played a crucial role in his reforms. Charlemagne promoted the rule of Saint Benedict as the standard for monastic life, ensuring consistency in prayer, discipline, and labor. Monasteries became centers of both spirituality and administration, places where scriptures were preserved, hospitality was offered, and local communities found guidance. Through them, the empire's spiritual fabric was strengthened, binding diverse regions to a common religious practice. Charlemagne also supported missionary efforts beyond his frontiers. He sent clerics to preach among the Slavs, the Danes, and other neighboring peoples, extending the reach of Christianity into lands not yet conquered. These missions reflected his conviction that the emperor's duty did not stop at borders. To bring the light of faith to distant peoples was part of his vocation as guardian of Christendom. Yet the relationship between emperor and church was not without tension. By crowning Charlemagne in 800, Pope Leo III signaled that imperial dignity came through papal hands. Charlemagne, however, carefully emphasized that his authority flowed from God directly, with the Pope as partner rather than master. This delicate balance between papal and imperial power would echo through the centuries, often erupting into conflict in later generations. Charlemagne managed it with tact, but the seeds of debate were already sown. Faith also touched Charlemagne's personal life. Though a man of power, he was devout in his own way. He attended daily services, supported the building of churches, and respected the rhythm of the liturgical calendar. He encouraged the singing of Roman chants, the uniformity of liturgical practice, and the careful copying of sacred texts. Even his court scholars, while reviving classical learning, worked within a framework where all knowledge was understood as service to God. It is soothing to imagine one of his imperial councils devoted to religious reform. Bishops and abbots gather in a timber hall, parchments spread before them, the air thick with the scent of beeswax candles. The emperor, tall and steady, listens intently as clerics debate the details of liturgy and doctrine. His presence reminds them that this is not mere ritual, but the shaping of an empire's soul. In such settings, faith and power intertwine seamlessly, one lending authority to the other. For the common people of the empire, Charlemagne's reforms meant that Christianity became the framework of everyday life. Villagers attended churches more regularly, heard sermons in their own tongue, and marked time by the cycle of feasts and fasts. The empire's unity was felt not only in armies and assemblies, but in the familiar rhythm of bells, chants, and prayers. As we drift gently toward the close of this section, it becomes clear that Charlemagne's legacy rests as much on faith as on conquest. His wars, reforms, and coronation all pointed toward a vision of Christendom united under one ruler, one church, and one God. Though imperfect in practice, this vision shaped the imagination of medieval Europe, offering a model of harmony between the sacred and the secular. In the soft stillness of history, we see him not only as a warrior and statesman, but as a shepherd of souls, striving to weave together the earthly and the divine. The empire Charlemagne forged seemed mighty, yet even during his lifetime, its unity required constant vigilance. After his death, the strain of succession and the centrifugal pull of regional powers would fragment what he had built. In this section, we move slowly into the twilight of his reign and beyond, watching as questions of inheritance, loyalty, and geography began to unweave the tapestry of empire. Charlemagne himself was keenly aware of the problem of succession. The Frankish custom of dividing lands among sons often weakened kingdoms, as brothers quarreled and regions drifted apart. Determined to avoid this, Charlemagne experimented with different plans. At one point, he crowned his eldest son, Charles the Younger, as co-king, and later granted territories to his other sons, Pippin and Louis. He envisioned an empire shared among them, bound together by loyalty and faith. Yet fate did not cooperate. Charles the Younger died in 811, and Pippin followed in 810. Only Louis the Pious remained by the time of Charlemagne's own death in 814. Louis was a capable and devout ruler, but the weight of his inheritance was enormous. He became emperor of a realm stretching from the Pyrenees to the Danube, from the North Sea to central Italy. Unlike his father, however, Louis lacked the commanding presence and martial vigor that had bound nobles together. His reign was marked by efforts at reform and piety, yet also by division. He too sought to divide the empire among his sons, and in doing so reopened the very cycle of fragmentation Charlemagne had hoped to end. The divisions became formalized in the Treaty of Verdun in 843, less than 30 years after Charlemagne's death. Louis's three surviving sons, Lothar, Charles the Bald, and Louis the German, partitioned the empire into three parts: West Francia, which would evolve into France; East Francia, the seat of Germany; and Middle Francia, a long, awkward strip stretching from the North Sea through Italy. This treaty marked the end of a unified Carolingian empire, though its memory lingered in the idea of Christendom and empire. Fragmentation was not only political, but also practical. The empire had always been diverse, encompassing Franks, Lombards, Saxons, Bavarians, and many others. Local identities proved stronger than imperial unity, especially once the personal presence of Charlemagne was gone. Nobles who had sworn loyalty to the emperor now found opportunities to assert independence. Frontiers faced renewed pressure from Vikings in the north, Saracens in the Mediterranean, and Magyars from the east. The weight of these invasions strained the weakened bonds of the Carolingian heirs. Yet it would be a mistake to see this decline only as failure. The Carolingian legacy endured in subtler ways. The structures Charlemagne built, the schools, monasteries, and administrative reforms continued to shape society. Even as political unity dissolved, the idea of empire survived. Later rulers, such as Otto I in the 10th century, would look back to Charlemagne as a model, reviving the title of Holy Roman Emperor and seeking once again to bind Europe under a Christian crown. It is worth pausing to consider the human side of this fragmentation. Imagine a Saxon village, newly baptized under Charlemagne, hearing of his death and wondering whether the empire's grip might loosen. Picture a Frankish noble debating whether to remain loyal to Louis the Pious or to secure his own independence. See a monk in a distant abbey, continuing to copy sacred texts, largely unaffected by imperial disputes, yet still living within the cultural framework Charlemagne had established. In each case, the empire's decline was experienced not as a single collapse, but as a gradual shift in loyalties, expectations, and rhythms of life. Charlemagne's burial itself reflected the fragility and grandeur of his legacy. He was laid to rest in the Palatine Chapel at Aachen, seated upon a throne, clad in imperial robes, with a golden sword by his side. The symbolism was clear. Even in death, he was emperor, a figure larger than life. His tomb became a site of memory, visited by pilgrims and admired by successors. The very building that had symbolized his reign now became the vessel of his legacy. As the empire fractured, myths and legends began to grow around his figure. Songs celebrated his deeds, often embellishing or transforming them. He was remembered not only as a king, but as a hero of Christendom, a defender of the faith, and even, in later centuries, as one of the Nine Worthies, a group of historical and legendary figures held up as models of chivalry. In this way, even as political unity dissolved, cultural memory kept Charlemagne alive in the imagination of Europe. In the gentle quiet of history, we can see both the rise and the decline of Charlemagne's empire as part of a cycle. What was built with vision and strength was undone by human mortality, by geography, and by the relentless pressures of time. Yet what endured was not merely borders or crowns, but an idea that Europe could, at least for a moment, be united under a single ruler, guided by faith and law. As we close this section, imagine the empire at dusk. The palaces still stand, the churches still ring their bells, but the certainty of unity begins to fade. A noble departs from Aachen, uncertain of where his loyalties should lie. A farmer continues to till his field, unchanged by distant treaties. A monk writes carefully upon parchment, unaware that his efforts will carry ancient wisdom across centuries. The empire fragments, but the story of Charlemagne remains, ready to echo into the centuries that follow. Charlemagne's death in 814 closed the chapter of a remarkable life, but the resonance of his reign continued to echo far beyond his own century. To understand his enduring legacy, we must look not only at the political consequences of his empire, but also at the cultural, religious, and symbolic ways he shaped the identity of Europe. This final section reflects calmly on how his name became a beacon for rulers, scholars, and ordinary people across the ages. When historians speak of Charlemagne, they often describe him as the father of Europe. This title is not meant literally, but symbolically, for he brought together lands that had been scattered after the fall of Rome. France, Germany, and Italy, nations that would later develop their own distinct paths, all traced aspects of their origins back to his empire. The unity he achieved, though temporary, offered a model of what a continental order might look like. His ability to hold diverse peoples together under a single crown, guided by Christian faith and Roman ideals, created a precedent that later rulers aspired to imitate. Politically, Charlemagne's legacy lived on through the Holy Roman Empire, founded when Otto I was crowned emperor in 962. Though centuries separated the two coronations, Otto and his successors looked to Charlemagne as their model. The very title, Holy Roman Emperor, evoked his memory, blending the spiritual mission of Christendom with the worldly grandeur of Rome. The institution endured for nearly 1,000 years, until 1806, demonstrating the lasting power of the idea first embodied by Charlemagne. Culturally, the Carolingian Renaissance preserved knowledge that might otherwise have been lost. Monks who copied manuscripts in the script Charlemagne ensured the survival of classical texts, from Roman poets to Christian theologians. Without their patient work, much of antiquity's wisdom could have vanished into oblivion. Later scholars of the 12th century Renaissance, and even the thinkers of the Italian Renaissance, owed a debt to the groundwork laid in Charlemagne's age. The clear, rounded script known as Carolingian minuscule became the ancestor of the fonts we use today, a subtle but constant reminder of his reforms. Religiously, Charlemagne's reign defined the relationship between church and state in medieval Europe. His vision of the emperor as protector of the church set a model that influenced debates for centuries. Later conflicts between popes and emperors, such as the investiture controversy, were shaped by the precedent of his coronation in 800. Even in tension, his example remained the reference point. For ordinary believers, the spread of Christianity into Saxon and other lands during his rule expanded the reach of the faith, making him a figure of missionary zeal as well as political might. The memory of Charlemagne also seeped into legend. Epic poems such as the Song of Roland cast him not as a historical monarch, but as a hero of chivalry, leading knights in battles that symbolized the struggle of Christendom against its enemies. These stories, often embellished and far removed from historical detail, nevertheless kept his name alive in popular imagination. To medieval listeners, Charlemagne was both king and myth, a bridge between history and legend. His tomb at Aachen became a shrine of memory. Successors sought to be crowned there, hoping to inherit his aura of legitimacy. Pilgrims visited to honor him, and in 1165, he was canonized by the antipope Paschal III, though this recognition was never universally accepted. Even without official sainthood, Charlemagne was venerated as a model of Christian rulership, a figure whose life embodied both worldly success and spiritual devotion. In modern times, his legacy has continued to inspire. In the 20th century, after the devastations of 2 world wars, European leaders seeking unity invoked his memory. The Charlemagne Prize, awarded annually in Aachen, honors those who promote European integration. Thus, even in a secular age, his name remains linked to the vision of a united continent. Yet Charlemagne's legacy is not without ambiguity. His campaigns against the Saxons, marked by forced conversions and harsh punishments, remind us of the violence embedded in his mission. His unity was often achieved through bloodshed, and the fragility of his empire after his death shows the limits of power. Still, his reign stands as a testament to what one ruler's vision and determination can achieve, even in an age of fragmentation. As we reflect on his legacy, it is soothing to picture not the clangor of battle, but the quiet of his chapel at Aachen. Candles flicker against marble columns, chants rise in measured tones, and the emperor rests beneath the stones, his presence lingering in memory. Outside, centuries roll forward. Empires rise and fall, nations form and dissolve. But within those walls, the idea of unity remains, tied forever to his name. Charlemagne's story is, at heart, a story of possibility. He showed that Europe could be more than scattered kingdoms, that faith and learning could be revived, that law and order could be nurtured, that the dream of empire could flicker once more. Though his empire fragmented, the memory of his reign became a foundation stone of European identity. To drift into sleep with his story is to rest upon the thought that greatness lies not only in power, but in the enduring influence of vision, culture, and faith. And so our journey through his life comes to its close. From Frankish prince to emperor crowned in Rome, from conqueror of Saxons to patron of learning, Charlemagne's path shaped a continent. His footsteps fade into the quiet of history, but his legacy lingers, like a soft echo across time, an echo that reminds us of the enduring quest for unity, meaning, and renewal.